Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
What a beautiful story. That book's going under my Christmas tree. A few of my friends will be getting a copy. Good evening, welcome to the show. Well, chaotic scenes in Canberra. Wait till you hear what I've got to take you through in relation to those detention issues. Here's what's coming up on Credlin. Labor releases its long-awaited review into national infrastructure. 50 road and rail projects scrapped, causing uproar from the states. But given big spending projects like Victoria's $200 billion suburban rail loop was exempt from scrutiny, you've got to ask how credible the report is anyway. Presidents Biden and Xi turn up at APEC. Biden at pains to downplay disagreement between the two nations. But in a clear sign about dangerous times ahead, Xi warns that the reunification of Taiwan, he says, is unstoppable. Plus another headache for UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak after early in the week being scorned by Conservatives for sacking Suella Braverman. This time, his asylum seeker plan has been dealt a crushing blow in British courts, ruling that sending migrants, illegal migrants to Rwanda is unlawful. We'll cross to the UK for an update because this is very relevant to us here in Australia. And another day of abject incompetence from the Albanese government over the issues where we now have 84 foreign criminals released into the Australian community. Legislation's now working its way through the parliament, but it's a mess. And the real worry is it won't even fix the problem, despite amendments from the opposition that Labor's been forced to accept.
The biggest failure is that they don't have before us today a new regime which would allow us to lock those detainees back up.
But first, Prime Ministers do have to travel, and I'd be the first in the media to acknowledge this, given I worked for one. But I also know what the demands of the job are when you're not walking the diplomatic red carpet, and that's my worry. Because the more I look at this Prime Minister, the more I see what's not getting done, what's being missed, what's being stuffed up as well. And it's hard to avoid the conclusion that Anthony Albanese would prefer to be on a plane than behind a desk. Worse than that, he's a once-over-lightly politician that just isn't doing the work needed to get across the detail and get things done that matter to everyday Australians. Tonight, the PM's in San Francisco, shaking hands with Joe Biden and Xi Jinping, two leaders he's already seen in the past couple of weeks. In fact, this is his 21st international trip in scarcely a year and a half. I mean, that is Rudd-esque and not in a good way. Meanwhile, Australia's cost of living crisis deepens, and we've got a whole lot of senior Labor ministers who seem confused about whether we're facing an outbreak of anti-Semitism or Islamophobia. Even though it's a new Holocaust that tens of thousands of people are marching in the street demanding Jews out of Israel, saying that Israel should be wiped out, with their cries of "from the river to the sea." But today it's all got worse, because the debacle over the handling of release into the community of some 84 foreign criminals exposes how clueless and indeed incompetent this Labor government really is. Yesterday, the Home Affairs Minister claimed that you can't out-legislate the High Court.
The idea that it is open to the Australian government to simply legislate away a High Court decision is not how our Constitution works.
Yet today, that minister introduced legislation to do just that. Although how much good it'll do is far from clear. And here's why. First up, the bill is about as rushed as I've ever seen. Now, I'd bet London to a brick they only issued drafting instructions in the last 24 hours. It needs urgent amendments if it's going to have any teeth at all. Indeed, that's what the opposition tried to do this morning in the House of Representatives, but Labor rejected their amendments to toughen up these draft laws. It then passed the House anyway because the government's got the numbers. But by question time, the acting PM, Richard Marles, well, he had rolled over, saying Labor would now work with the coalition in the Senate to make the legislation as good as it could be.
This morning, we introduced into the Parliament the Migration Amendment Bridging Visa Conditions Bill of 2023. Since then, we have been working cooperatively with the opposition around amendments to this piece of legislation.
Now, despite that cooperation that the acting PM says he's got, despite that, there is a problem. Even with this legislation, not one of the 84 criminals, foreign criminals, out in the community right now will be locked up. Not one. Now, worse than that, we also find out today there's another 340 of them that could still be released. On this point, here is Peter Dutton in the House today.
The Prime Minister has taken a decision not to re-detain these 84 serious criminals. This morning at 7:15, we get the hapless Immigration Minister and the hopeless Minister for Home Affairs in there, who moves from one disaster to the next, comes in there and says, here's the bill. They throw the bill onto the table and say, here's the bill. Will you support it? We want your bipartisan support. We said, well, there are countless provisions in this bill and we want more than an hour and a quarter to be able to look at it, to take legal advice and to decide our position. Because we think, even on the first quick read of it, it is completely and totally inadequate. Not just are we talking about the 84 out now and the 8 about to be released, we're now talking about a pipeline of 340 people. And potentially more beyond that. Potentially more beyond that.
340. And in question time, the opposition pushed the government again and again on this point. What are you doing, they asked, to try and keep the 340 odd locked up in detention?
Will the acting Prime Minister commit the government to passing preventative detention legislation to stop the 340 hardened criminals from being released?
And then this fence-sitting twaddle from the acting Prime Minister.
We do nothing to promote community safety by taking steps in this place which will not survive legal challenge. And that's to state the most obvious fact.
No answer, just a whole lot of blah, blah, blah. Now, I know how this works, and this is where the government's let Australians down, and they are not telling you the truth. They want to try and blame this on the High Court, that they were somehow caught off guard by the court's decision last Wednesday. Now, that is utter rubbish. The Immigration Minister and the Home Affairs Minister, quite possibly to the Attorney-General, they would all have got a brief from their departmental officials getting clearance from the ministers for the defence that was then run by the Commonwealth in this High Court case. So the briefs would have been on desks months and months and months ago. And in those briefs, or one that would have come immediately after the initial one, there would have been advice as to what would happen if they won the case and what would happen if they lost it. There would then have been talk about a plan B. You're going to lose it, Minister. If you lose it, here's our plan B. And they would have all then sat down and talked about actioning a plan B if they were doing their jobs properly. As Peter Dutton again admitted this morning, now he's a former Home Affairs Minister himself, the government knew months ago that on this issue they were in trouble.
They were told by the High Court in June that the High Court had changed its mind or had problems. They should have been drafting legislation from then. And again, we couldn't get a straight answer on that this morning.
So here we are. As I said, even with this legislation, these foreign criminals will stay on the streets because the government isn't willing to go in as hard as it should. These foreign criminals will all still be eligible for welfare and rent assistance and travel assistance, even $10,000 worth of support to help them set up a home. And what, you want to know, what do their victims get?
One of the hardcore criminals who's been released into the Australian community is Mohammed Rafiq, who has been convicted of both rape and sexual assault. On hearing of him being released into the Brisbane community, his victim said that she started crying immediately and felt a numbness. Has the Minister or his department contacted this victim to provide her with any reassurance, assistance or support?
And now listen to the weak response from Immigration Minister Andrew Giles.
I can't comment on individual cases. The Department of Home Affairs is and has been engaging closely with state and territory enforcement agencies and proactively sharing information. It's also incumbent on our state and territory law enforcement agencies to enforce existing state and territory requirements.
And seriously, get your head out of your notes, mate. I mean, this is huge, and you're not across the detail. Peter Dutton quite rightly says not good enough. Let's not forget too, he's a former police detective before he entered the Parliament.
Can the Acting Prime Minister give an assurance that the government will make contact with each of the victims of these 84 individuals, and in the cases where the victim is deceased, the victim's family?
I mean, the point surely is not to have foreign criminals resident in Australia, regardless of how many times they have to report to police or might wear these ankle bracelets, which I might add are not even mandatory. They're at the discretion of that minister. Or even if Labor does nothing, it should at least make sure the victims are notified. But it gets worse. We learned today that in addition to welfare, these foreign criminals can be paid hundreds of thousands of dollars each in compensation for their indefinite detention. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars each after they abused Australia and our hospitality, after they were found not to be refugees, after they refused to go home or the countries they came from refused to take them back. But as bad as all of that is, the biggest issue here, because governments all have to deal with thorny problems, often thorny problems all at the one time, is that this government is starting to look increasingly clueless and incompetent. Now, a Prime Minister is a bit like a conductor of an orchestra. It goes well enough if all the musicians can play their instruments and the conductor out the front knows the score. But if that's not the case, it's a whole lot of amateurs thrashing about. And that's where the government is at now. No one has got the music in front of them. Most of them can't even play a tune. And the conductor, well, he's away from the podium and out of the room most of the time. Out more times than he's in the room. No wonder there's such a cacophony. And this is a Prime Minister who's too often missing in action, leading a government that's divided between a handful of pragmatists and a majority of hard left, green left ideologues. And with over now 80 hardened criminals on the street, more yet likely to be released and paid millions in compensation too, I tell ya, Australians are the real losers. Tell you, I am pretty fired up and cranky tonight. I think this is an absolute travesty. Absolute travesty. We'll go to camera now for the headlines. Sky News political reporter Joel Philp.
Good evening. The federal government has caved in to opposition demands to strengthen its emergency laws to restrict the freedoms of detainees released after last week's High Court ruling that indefinite detention was illegal. The government has agreed to mandatory curfews and electronic monitoring, and that released detainees not be allowed to work with children or go close to schools. Most importantly, they can be jailed for breaching the tough new conditions. Sky News understands the compromise to add 6 amendments to the legislation was struck after angry criticism by Peter Dutton in the House of Representatives.
They throw the bill onto the table and say, here's the bill. Will you support it? We want your bipartisan support, because we think even on the first quick read of it, it is completely and totally inadequate.
A delegation of ministers, led by Acting Prime Minister Richard Marles, went to Mr Dutton's office in Parliament, asking him what the opposition wanted. The compromise cut the Greens out of any deal-making.
This is Anthony Albanese's Tampa moment.
At least 3 states have lashed out at the federal government after it cancelled 50 infrastructure projects across the country, following a review which recommended the axing of dozens more.
When the Minister said that the Commonwealth would back projects that are contracted, we expect her and her government to stick to its word.
The infrastructure cuts announced this morning by the Federal Infrastructure Minister are a body blow to Queensland.
The Infrastructure Minister says cost blowouts force the project cuts, but the government has still committed the same amount of money, $120 billion, to the National Infrastructure Pipeline.
There are no cuts to Queensland at all. There are no cuts.
The Prime Minister has touched down in the United States for the APEC summit, where US President Joe Biden claims real progress was made with China after high-stakes talks with Xi Jinping. It's the second time they've met since Joe Biden became president.
For two large countries like China and the United States, turning their back on each other is not an option. It is unrealistic for one side to remodel the other.
The talks lasted more than 4 hours, canvassing issues from the wars in Gaza and Ukraine to the global economy. Taiwan remains the biggest potential flashpoint. President Xi told President Biden to stop arming the island, warning reunification was unstoppable. There are still fundamental differences that divide the two nations.
And Mr. President, after today, would you still refer to President Xi as a dictator?
Well, look, he is. I mean, he's a dictator in the sense that he is a guy who runs a country that is a communist country.
All right, a lot to get through. Joining me now for the latest. Radio 2GB host Michael McLaren and Herald Sun columnist Patrick Carline. Michael and Patrick, welcome. You probably heard enough out of me in terms of that editorial. This is all an attempt to mop up that decision from the High Court last week, but it's been made so much worse today, I think, by a government that not only flat-footed in their response, Michael McLaren, but slow. And what staggers me is this revelation that none of these people, none of these 84 out in the community now will be locked up after this legislation passes, if it does, through the Senate. But we could have another 340 foreign criminals let out.
Yeah, Peter, they were strong words at the start and I commend you for them. I think you're speaking what you said there, really what a lot of Australians will be thinking, and probably just quietly what some in even the government are thinking how the hell did it come to this? But I mean, there's been a lot of discussion in the last 48 hours or so about Peter Dutton's attack on the government on this, as well as his criticism against Anthony Albanese before he left for America on his government's approach to anti-Semitism. Whether there's a connection there or not, I don't know. But what I would say is there is a connection, I think, really, between the voice debate and this, because I think, is this not another example of government and government ministers distracted, certainly over the last 5 months in this circumstance, with the voice, trying to get that across the line? That was the be-all and end-all. That was the litmus test of the government's ability to prosecute a case. Clearly things were missed, and this is one hell of a miss. As you said, it's not as if the High Court decision was necessarily a surprise. It certainly wasn't as if the High Court deciding when it did hand down its findings that the timing was a surprise. This has been a case before the court, I believe, at least 5 months. And as you say, you're quite right, when these things go before the court, you've got to prepare for a negative outcome as much as be ready to celebrate continuity with a positive outcome. So clearly there was nowhere near, if none, preparation actually done. The government and therefore the Australian public have been caught very, very much on the hop here, and it's simply not good enough. Peter Dutton is right to prosecute the case that he is.
And of course, Patrick, you get the situation where we know they're all on welfare. We know Australians are doing it tough. We've got pensioners that can't keep the lights on, but these foreign criminals are getting welfare. We have those reports today that they're very likely to get hundreds of thousands of dollars in compensation as well. You can understand why people are furious, can't you?
Oh, look, certainly pensioners, Peter, but I think most Australians are furious. I mean, they don't want these people on their streets. They're now on the streets. And now you've got the double whammy to what you rightly called a travesty, where they're looking at compensation claims, which have been described by the Solicitor General as undefendable, I think was the term he used. And so basically we're going to look at tens of millions of dollars being paid out to these people who we don't want and we never wanted. I can understand why pensioners are upset. The cost of living, you know, is terrible at the moment for all Australians. And here are people going to get these massive payouts for having done the wrong thing over a long time. I mean, it's outrageous on so many levels.
I've got to ask you, Michael McLaren, could you take talk back? You've got an ear to the ground, particularly in Sydney. What are people telling you about the Prime Minister's travel? I mean, I'll get into the detail in a moment about what was discussed at APEC, but are they noticing he's travelling a lot? Are they happy with it? Are they saying, no, he's got to focus on stuff at home?
It's noted. There's no doubt it's noted. Look, the opinion is split, although by far the majority say that the travel really has to be reined in, and I think most people would concur with that. Look, if the American president invites the Australian Prime Minister to a state event it's a pretty courageous Prime Minister that says, no, sorry, President, I'm not going to come. And in light of recent history, face-to-face with the Chinese leader, you can certainly mount the case to attend. But we're now looking at 21, aren't we? 21 overseas journeys, more no doubt to come. Some of these needn't have been delivered by the Prime Minister or attended by the Prime Minister. You have ministers, capable or otherwise, I suppose, who you could send for a lot of them. And heaven forbid, we learned through COVID you can do Zoom on occasions too. So, look, the public sense, and I think some in the newspapers are picking up on this as well as obviously Talkback Radio, that there are some fires at home that need attending. And it is not a good look, if nothing else, that the Prime Minister isn't here to, use his own words, hold the hose. And it's becoming increasingly difficult for him to justify more and more, even important, overseas visits, even if they have some outcomes. It's harder and harder to justify when all isn't well at home.
Let's go to another issue that's struck me as very interesting, Patrick, today out of Canberra. Labor has rejected a proposal from the coalition at a federal level to ban the Nazi salute. Now, this is a split in the powerful Security and Intelligence Committee. Labor love to imply that anyone on the right, even parties of the centre-right, like the Liberal Party and others, that somehow they're supportive of the far right, that Nazi edge and fringe, sadly, that's here in Australia and around the world. But it's Labor this time. Labor are the ones that are not reining in Nazi sympathisers. Did this surprise you?
Look, I think in normal times, Peter, I mean, I don't like bans. State governments like banning things, local councils like banning things. But these aren't normal times. I mean, the waves of anti-Semitism washing across Australia at the moment are unprecedented, certainly in my lifetime. And the idea that the symbolism of not being able to ban a Nazi salute, which takes you straight back to 1939 Germany, and also the hateful rhetoric that's been thrown around at the moment. I mean, the talk of the Palestinian river to the sea. I mean, decoded, basically saying let's eliminate a country and its people. That takes you straight back to Germany in 1939. And the idea that we can't ban a Nazi salute, which is plainly so offensive, I find very puzzling, to say the least.
And I might add too, in Melbourne, we've got kids striking for climate change tomorrow, and next week in Melbourne, next Friday, they're striking from class to go to pro-Palestinian rallies. Michael McLaren, Patrick Carline, thank you both for your time. All right, let's go to the whole issue in Israel. We'll get to APEC as well. Bringing in an expert to join me now, Michael Shoebridge, Director of Strategic Analysis Australia. Michael, thank you. We've got absolutely clear evidence tonight, and I think the international community is digesting and reacting to it, that Hamas now has been proven to be using hospitals as terror bases, don't we?
Yes, we do, Peter. We have very compelling physical evidence direct about that Al-Shifa hospital, particularly about the special facilities that Hamas built in the basement to hold hostages, and of course a whole lot of Hamas weaponry and tunnels connecting the hospital with Hamas leaders' houses.
This has long been, obviously, and I saw it myself personally, in and around the issues of Islamic State. This has been a playbook by some terror groups in the past. We know there was a cache of weapons found, AK-47s, explosives and everything there today. What does this mean for charities and international organisations, and I think here of the UN and others, who have been raising money and donating money to Gaza's health system? Are they now complicit in Hamas terror?
Well, Peter, I think they have to admit that they've been actively used as human and international shields for a terrorist organisation. They can't pretend that this isn't happening. They must now acknowledge that Hamas has used, exploited and manipulated them, and the effect has been to enable the Hamas terrorists.
And of course, I say here too, for the Palestinian people there, money's been donated in good faith for their health, for their education, over many years since Israel left Gaza well and truly over almost 2 decades ago. And that money's been misused for terror, hasn't it?
Yes. Yes, Peter. There is no good Hamas and bad Hamas. Hamas is a terrorist organisation who exist to exterminate the state of Israel and as many Jewish people as they can in the process. So the idea we could quarantine international assistance to good Hamas, delivering services to the Palestinians, and stop bad Hamas, the terrorists, getting access to it, is just nonsense.
I wish other experts, Michael Shoebridge, had your clarity on that issue. Let's go to the domestic issues inside the Home Affairs portfolio more broadly. Australia's National Cyber Security Coordinator has been recalled to Defence. He's not been stood down formally. I think the term is recalled to deal with a workplace matter. We don't have a lot of clarity about what that is, but the government was supposed to put out its updated cyber security strategy next week. Unclear now what will happen there, and certainly cybersecurity is a big issue. But we also have the head of the Home Affairs portfolio, Michael Pezzullo, still under investigation for text messages. Now, either the messages were in breach of the Public Service Act or they won't, or they weren't. I don't understand why it takes only 4 months or so to have an investigation on that front. But, you've got two very senior players in Australia's national security apparatus, both stood aside. How concerning is this to you?
Well, Peter, this is like calling up a company and getting a call centre message. Your call is important, but the service has been interrupted. There is no next available operator to be the Secretary of Home Affairs or to be the Cyber Security Coordinator. These are key government roles that need to be filled urgently by highly capable people. And in the case of Darren Goldie, I just wonder how something could be so grave to have done what's happened. I hope for a very speedy resolution, but really these roles are too important to be leaving vacant or having temporary people step in.
I want to get your take on APEC too. We had that meeting today, highly stylised, as you'd expect, between Presidents Biden and Xi Jinping. They've both agreed to resume communication. That is a good thing. But Xi made it very clear he intends to reunite, and I use that term loosely. The Taiwanese would say they've never been united at all with the mainland Chinese Communist Party, but he wants it back into one country. He's made it very clear that is unstoppable. That was the words used by Xi. Does this mean war, do you think?
Not necessarily, Peter, but I think you're right to see that the big thing out of the Xi-Biden meeting was two wary, distrustful leaders meeting without pretending they were doing anything but an arm wrestle. So Biden talked first off about being in competition with China and about needing to work with partners and allies and invest in American strength. And Xi pretty much said, I wish you'd stop doing everything you're doing and just let me get on with business. Such a contrast to the Albanese meeting. Biden looked like a wary statesman dealing with a very difficult adversary, and Albanese looked like a salesman delighted to get his foot in the front door.
Oh, you're so true to pick that up. You are so true to pick that up. We'll watch with interest, Michael Shoebridge. We'll see what the communique looks like when it comes out over the weekend. Thank you for your time. Thank you. All right, coming up, regional Australia loses yet again from the Albanese government after massive cuts to infrastructure were released today across the board. Plus, we'll go to the UK, where pressures on Prime Minister Rishi Sunak to deal with illegal migration now that he's lost his Supreme Court case on Rwanda. Coming up, Environment Minister Tanya Plibersek gearing up to do a deal with the Greens to take previous irrigation water off farmers and send it downstream to the Southern Ocean. But first, that deeply concerning issue, 84 foreign criminals in the Australian community and the real risk that hundreds more will be released. We saw that massive backflip from Labor in the House around question time today, rightly capitulating to the Coalition's demands that they need to strengthen their legislation. It will now go to the Senate to be voted on. And joining me is someone who will be front and centre in that fight, the Leader of the Nationals in the Senate, the Shadow Infrastructure Minister, Bridget McKenzie. Bridget, thank you for your time. Let's just start here if we can. Labor have been dragged kicking and screaming to this issue, but I have to say, even if it passes the Senate with all of your amendments agreed, it doesn't do anything about the 83 on the streets, or the 84 on the street, and the likely 340 that Labor say they will release.
And Peter, it's great to be with you, and we're debating this right now in the Senate. It's incredibly concerning, and it just shows you and your viewers the level of incompetence of this Labor government. I mean, it beggars belief that when a decision is before a High Court, that a government doesn't get advice on it falling either way, so they have all options available to them to ensure the safety and security of our citizens. And I think we've seen an appalling lack of judgment, lack of preparation from this government, and they have actually had to be dragged to doing the right thing. But you're right, our grave concern is that these rapists, murderers, pedophiles that are currently out there in our communities will commit crimes before the government can actually get this situation under control. So thankfully we are debating this and doing what we can tonight, but it's too late, and I hope everyone will be safe in the meantime.
I'll get to infrastructure because I know it's your portfolio area and there was big news there today, but just in terms of timing, are you going to sit as long as necessary and have this passed before the weekend?
Well, as always, the Coalition's greatest focus is on keeping Australians safe. Our track record in government shows that. And so we're not going to play politics with this at all. Labor has finally done the right thing, and we are going to make sure that we can get this passed as soon as possible with as many amendments as we can, because to strengthen what seems to be quite a rushed piece of legislation from the government.
You are not wrong there. Okay, let's go to infrastructure.
Yep.
Excellent. Great. Thank you, Bridget. That report comes out today. The government commissioned it some time ago. A whole lot of projects now have been scrapped. This is a $120 billion capital works pipeline. I know communities, particularly in Queensland and in Victoria, have been waiting many, many years for these projects to come to fruition. They're gone today. She wants to try and blame the former government, saying that they were unfunded, these projects were unfunded. But I mean, I tell you, I remember when the Abbott government got in 2013, all the promises about the NDIS, it wasn't funded outside the forward estimates. Nothing really is. And of course, you've got more and more migrants coming in, and we need more and more infrastructure. There's a lot of very angry Australians today that are losing their roads that were promised and all the other things. Bridget, what can you tell us?
Yeah, Peter, you're dead right. I mean, and you know better than anyone the important work that we did in government to actually smoothing that boom-bust infrastructure investment pipeline out so that communities, state governments and contractors actually had certainty over a long period of time. And you've heard it from Labor treasurers and infrastructure ministers to local councillors and community groups, the level of outrage that 50 projects have just been slashed, and that's from Faster Rail to Geelong in my home state, to a whole raft of projects. The M7, M12 links in Sydney, which was really to connect Sydney to Western Sydney Airport. These projects have been cut, and what I think is more concerning is there's 250 projects that have been thrown into uncertainty. We don't know whether they're going to be cut or delayed. And so there's still this great level of uncertainty, which means contractors are going to be sweating that equipment. They're actually going to be stressing about the workforce that they've got on, and communities are not getting the infrastructure they need whilst Labor's bringing in 1.5 million additional people. It just beggars belief. And you're right, Catherine King's trying to blame the former coalition government. They're also sucker punched the state Labor governments by making them ultimately responsible for the tough decisions. And you know, when we're in government, you do have to make the tough decisions about spending priorities. And this government has chose to invest in $328 billion of energy infrastructure in the next 8 years instead of critical road and rail infrastructure in our congested suburbs and regions.
I have to say, if you're an Australian who lives in a regional community, I think you're really hard done by tonight, because we know the Prime Minister exempted that absolute white elephant, Victoria's $200 billion suburban rail loop, from any scrutiny, but they scrapped this, the fast rail project from Geelong, big growth corridor from Geelong and Melbourne. Now, that makes sense. Suburban rail doesn't make sense, but you know when they won't even look at it, that it's a dog.
That's
right? It's a bad policy.
Absolutely.
But they wouldn't even look at it.
Absolutely. So what was ruled out of the review? The suburban rail loop. We heard from the Minister this week they're going to have to end up putting in an additional $9 billion on top of the $2 they've already put in. They've exempted the stadiums. Remember the sweetheart deals with both Tasmania and Queensland state governments to get them across the line in other policy areas. The stadiums were exempt from the review, as were all the election promises from Labor. So it was really only those critical projects that communities had fought so hard for so long to be delivered. Things like, the Frankston-Baxter rail link. I mean, you can't get an any more growing region than sort of Melbourne to Geelong and therefore Melbourne to Baxter, and that's been cancelled as well. In Penrith, Mulgoa Road upgrade. We've got these 1.5 million new arrivals flooding into Western Sydney, and you're actually cutting the connectivity infrastructure to make it livable. So it just doesn't make sense. But you're right, the regions are incredibly hard done by with that change in funding arrangement. Essentially, we've got a 30% cut to funding to the regions. And if you've driven on a road outside a capital city these days,
I have,
right across the country, we need the investment out there.
I hit a pothole on the Ballarat Highway just outside of Creswick, took my car out of action for over a week. Hey, just quickly, the Nats went out today calling for an ACCC inquiry into meat pricing. Why is that?
Well, because we know that the price of sheep has fallen through the floor thanks to, in part, the Labor government's decision to end the live sheep export trade. I've been hearing from sheep farmers that had to truck 600 head to the sale yard for $7 a head. No takers, truck them home. $14 a head. It's cheaper actually to be shooting sheep in the paddock at the moment than putting them on the truck to the sale yard. And the ACCC has actual powers to investigate while that decrease in cost isn't being passed through at the checkout. So someone's making a mozza, and the ACCC is just the body to actually investigate who, but they need direction from Jim Chalmers. So this team talks a big game on cost of living. They've got a plan. I tell you, Jim, one thing you could do tomorrow is get your pen out, direct the ACCC to actually investigate this and make sure that the cost cutting that's going on in the supply chain is actually passed on to the checkout.
To the consumers, particularly coming into Christmas. Bridget McKenzie, thank you. Good luck with the late sittings tonight. We'll go to the UK after the break. There's been that crisis on the Rwanda decision in the UK. It feeds into the people smuggling trade. That's why it's relevant to Australia. And an endometriosis charity now led by a transgender activist. This is a women's biological charity. You can't make it up if you tried. Welcome back. Let's go to the UK now, where Britain's Supreme Court has just ruled that the Sunak government's plan to send asylum seekers to Rwanda is unlawful. Under the plan, Britain would have sent tens of thousands of asylum seekers who had arrived on its shores without permission to the East African country in a bid to deter migrants from crossing the Channel from Europe in small boats into the UK, inspired, of course, by the Abbott government's policy of sending illegal asylum seekers to offshore detention centres. However, Prime Minister Sunak says he hasn't given up. He says he'll still press ahead with the plan regardless of the court's ruling. Joining me now to discuss this, writer, broadcast and Danube Institute fellow, David Oldroyd-Bolt. David, welcome to the show. Great to catch up with you recently in London. It's a big issue here, obviously, border protection in Australia. I was always heartened you'd taken some lessons from us in the UK, but it appears to be scuttled by this decision. Sunak says, your Prime Minister says, he's going to press ahead anyway. What's likely to happen?
Well, the problem is for us, compared with you, we don't have Nauru. We don't have a country that, under the many, many UN treaties governing this, under the ECHR and under our own domestic legislation, is considered a safe country which does not fall foul of non-refoulement laws. That is to say, that it does not fall foul of the law saying that you must not send illegal immigrants to a country where they run the risk of being persecuted. What is likely to happen is that Mr Sunak will fail in any attempt he makes to push this through because it is quite simply illegal under international law. What should happen is that Mr Sunak, if he were a statesman of any stature and vision, would now lead a Europe-wide movement to rewrite the treaties that were perfectly reasonable in the light of 1945, when this was essentially a European problem, when national borders were respected and when we did not have international immigration of this sort, of migrants from all around the world trying to seek better lives for thousands of miles around them. The problem is that I don't think that he will do that. Though Denmark, Austria, Germany, Italy, many other European countries are having similar problems, I don't think that Mr Sunak will look at this in the round. Instead, he will try to push this through and he will fail.
I guess the problem you've got too is a lot of them are young men, Arab backgrounds, coming from the same sort of regions, and they're landing in your country. They're costing your taxpayers literally millions and millions of pounds. You had a strong Home Secretary, Suella Braverman. She has now been sacked this week for issues to do with the pro-Palestinian rallies and really taking the police to task. But in her departure, she puts out a 3-page statement and she says that the Prime Minister has manifestly failed to deliver on his promises to deal with this issue and radical gender theory as well, I might add. I think she's right, but how on earth are you going to get movement if you've got someone like David Cameron, who loves his Brexit, wanted to remain, now back in the senior ranks?
Well, it's a question that we're all asking, those of us who are actually Conservatives. How do you expect this to happen? I think Suella Braverman was ill-advised to call these marches hate marches because it simply stirs up all those who wish for her departure to activate for it even more than they were before, and it has succeeded. She was also ill-advised, I think, to write the piece that she did in the Times, although we now suspect that Mr Cameron, or sorry, I should say Lord Cameron, was asked if he wished to be Foreign Secretary and therefore for James Cleverly to become Home Secretary before Ms Braverman wrote this piece in the Times. So I think there was a little bit of backroom dealing going on here. But the point remains that Mr Sunak is not capable under existing legislation, national or international, of getting rid of the illegal immigrants who are coming to these shores. And let us not forget that they are passing through safe countries in order to arrive here. They are then being passed on because we are seen by the rest of Europe as being essentially an easy touch. And I do wonder if there is an aspect here of revenge for Brexit, particularly from the French. They were absolutely infuriated by the vote in 2016. They were themselves stymied in their attempts to make it a truly awful Brexit for us. And I think there is a sort of lover's revenge going on here. They have been left in the lurch. We have gone off to pastures new, seeking brighter sunlit uplands, and they're determined to punish us for it. And one of the ways they are doing this is by not fulfilling their statutory duty to keep the illegal immigrants who are coming into their country. Instead, they're passing them on to us.
David, just before we go, when I was there, I was shocked at the size of those crowds in central London, pro-Palestinian marches. You had 300,000 last weekend. I'm told organisers are saying that they're going to continue on unabated. Is there anything that can be done about them? Because they're virulently anti-Semitic, I have to say.
There is a great deal that could be done. For instance, last night when pro-Palestinian protesters, pro-Hamas protesters, were mounting war memorials, the police could well have arrested them under public order offences. The Met Police put out a really weak, pathetic statement saying that there is no specific criminal offence about clambering on war memorials. No, there isn't, but there are many public order offences on the statute book which could have been used to arrest these people. The police have massive powers for policing protest, as we saw during the pandemic, for instance. instance, when they used them against anti-lockdown campaigners, which they did not use against BLM campaigners, for instance, as they used against the people who gathered in vigil on Clapham Common after the murder by a Metropolitan policeman of Sarah Everard. They used those powers that they have when they did not use them against Extinction Rebellion. This seems to me to be a very clear illustration of what Ms Braverman said about two-tier policing. It is something that all Londoners and now all Britons are seeing for themselves. The Metropolitan Police needs to be brought into hand, and part of the responsibility of the Home Secretary is to do that. So I hope that Mr Cleverly, in his first week in office, will begin to take a grasp where perhaps his predecessor, because of her perceived antipathy to the police, was unable to do so.
All right, David, great to catch up with you live on camera and give us a sense of everything that's going on. That was terrific. David Oldroyd-Bolt there live from London. All right, after the break, my panel, a whole lot of stuff to get through. Court pronouns is a big issue with a dangerous male sex offender in New South Wales. After the break. Right, a few things to get through. Let's get into it. My panel now, Shadow Minister for Environment, Fisheries and Forestry, Tasmanian Senator John O'Donoghue, and former Liberal MP, my good friend Nicole Flint. Let's start with you, Nicole. This court case in New South Wales, Senator Claire Chandler has slammed the courts up there for using female pronouns for a male sex offender, even while the courts were detailing his decades of offending and his ongoing danger to women and girls. This bloke is now in the community posing as a woman. I think it's unbelievable.
It is unbelievable, Peter, and to the best of my knowledge, this is the first major case of this type that we've seen in Australia. We've seen multiple examples in Britain. The British women have been warning us about this. And let's trace this back to where it all began in Australia, which was under Julia Gillard's government and under current Attorney General Mark Dreyfus, when they changed the Sex Discrimination Act back in 2013 to delete the definition of woman. That's where this madness started. And Peter, it has to be fixed. And I will be lobbying hard for the coalition to take this to the next election. And I will continue to remind people that it was Julia Gillard, the so-called champion of women, and the Labor government, many of whom are sitting on the front bench still now, who did this to women and put us all at risk.
Spot on, Nicole Flint. I know you're indefatigable. And one of those women, Tanya Plebiscite, she was there. She's now the Environment and Water Minister. She's trying to cut a deal with the Greens. She wants to get her plan through the upper house, restoring our rivers bill. This will take irrigation water from farmers and send it downriver for so-called environmental flows. John O'Donoghue, it'll come to the Senate. What's the likelihood of it getting coalition support? Where's this up to?
Well, the onus is on the government to actually do the job they were elected to do, and that is to govern on behalf of all Australians, those irrigators in the upper reaches of the basin and those who live in the lower reaches, to make sure they have the environmental flows. I mean, it's not an all or nothing. I know it is a complex issue, but the approach being taken by the government and the fact that they're looking at removing this social and economic neutrality impact test is quite concerning, because it says to us that some of the approaches they're going to take are going to have an impact. Now, if you take the water out of the top end, you're going to find that it's going to be impossible to grow the things that we need and to support those regional communities. That's going to have massive flow-on implications. And Perrin Davey and others in the shadow cabinet have been pushing hard to make sure that isn't the case. And so we're going to be pushing this government to make sure they do what they said they would, and that is govern for all Australians and get the balance right, not do everything the Greens want, because that would be a complete disaster.
Nicole, we're in the middle of redistributions at a federal level, so this will impact the seats at the next election. Victoria and New South Wales will both lose a seat because there's been population changes. What's interesting in New South Wales, though, the two seats that are under fire are Teal seats. Seat of Warringah, Tony Abbott's old seat, the seat of North Sydney, Joe Hockey's old seat. And you've got Zali Steggall and Kylie Tink both making, I think, conflicting suggestions about who should lose their seat. It looks like they're almost at war. How do you see this playing out?
Peter, the Australian Electoral Commission will do whatever they like. I know it from bitter personal experience. I went through a redistribution in 2018 before the 2019 election, and the AEC did a lot of damage to my boundary. So we mounted a vehement campaign to try to prevent any change to my boundary, to the boundaries of Boothby at the time, because my community was amazing. It remains amazing. So they can say whatever they like. The AEC will do whatever they like.
Hey, just quickly, I know you're a huge fighter for the issue of endometriosis, but I read that you've got a transgender activist now running endometriosis charities in the UK.
It's unbelievable, Peter. Again, this is a biological male who says that he is a woman. And on this particular issue, it's really confronting for women like me who have endometriosis. But this individual has actively campaigned against women and against feminists. He's been at protests outside of feminist conferences. So it's just offensive that they have employed this individual.
It is.
And I feel enormously sorry for women with endo.
100% Nicole, I've got to go. I'm out of time. See everyone tomorrow night. Here's Andrew Bolt.